Hello everyone, my name is Eleanor. In this video abstract, I will briefly explain our experimental study on how children show better delayed memory for implicitly learned word forms compared with adults. The study will be published in Developmental Science. Okay, let's begin with a question. How do children versus adults learn novel skills? Children are often found to outperform adults on learning various skills, such as those that involve language learning or learning a novel motor skill. Adults, in contrast, are superior on most tests of cognitive abilities, particularly those that rely on attention or explicit and declarative knowledge. And this age-dependent shift is due to a neurological change at the level of two long-term memory systems, namely an early developed implicit memory system that relies on striatal structures, or the basal ganglia, and a late maturing explicit system within the frontal and medial temporal lobe. And it has been argued that children's superiority in skill learning might have its basis in these early developed implicit learning abilities that shift to explicit learning only later in life. And although there is evidence for this idea in the motor skill learning literature, the question remains about what happens for language learning. Children are believed to be better language learners than adults. However, there is no much experimental evidence for this hypothesis. Only a few studies have directly compared implicit language learning abilities between children and adults under the same learning conditions. And the few studies that did this comparison often found worse performance in children than in adults. And this is not surprising because children have smaller memory and attention capacities compared with adults. However, this is not what we would predict if we believe that children are better language learners. These studies, however, did not look at what happens in the longer term after a consolidation period. And some studies that did look into long-term memory observed better delayed memory in children compared with adults. So even though children learned less within the initial session, they were better able to retain this across sessions, while adults seem to significantly forget. And this is a very interesting observation. However, there is no much experimental evidence for it. So in the present study, we were interested in investigating child-adult differences in the delayed memory for novel word forms that were either acquired implicitly or explicitly. To do so, we used an adaptation of the well-known HEP repetition learning task as an implicit learning analog to novel word form learning. In this HEP task, sequences of phonemes or syllables are presented to participants for immediate serial recall. Unknown by the participants, however, some of these syllables are repeated in exactly the same order every third trial. And what you typically see is that participants become better in recalling the entire sequence as a function of this repetition. And that means that they have started to create a long-term memory representation or a chunk of individual presented syllables as a function of this repeated exposure. Studies using this task have shown that these chunked representation also compete with words in the mental lexicon. In other words, the implicitly repeated exposure to sequences of individual phonemes or syllables gradually and implicitly result in long-term memory representations or chunks that resemble novel word forms. And therefore, the HEP repetition learning mechanism is argued to be an experimental analog to novel word form learning. In the present study, we exposed a group of 8-year-old children and adults to auditory sequences of 9 syllables for immediate recall. To facilitate word segmentation processes and make the task more attractive and word-like, the sequences were also presented together with drawings of unfamiliar creatures. So for each sequence of 9 syllables, a given drawing was presented on the screen together with a subgroup of 3 successive syllables within that sequence, so that each 3-syllable chunk potentially became associated with a novel picture. 2 sequences of syllables were repeated in the same order across the experiment. We call these the HEP sequences. One of these two HAP sequences was explicitly announced to the participants, so that participants became aware of the repetition and its mapping to the drawing. This was done by using verbal instructions prior to learning, and by using a visual and auditory cue during trial exposure. So a red border appeared around the screen and a beeping sound was presented every time the repetition of the sequence occurred. All participants returned to the lab after 4 hours, 1 week, and 1 year to measure their long-term retention performance for the repeating sequences. Okay, now we have come to the results. Within session, we observed that children overall performed worse than adults. Their ability to immediately recall the order of all 9 syllables within the sequence was worse than that of adults, which is not surprising, given that the length of the sequences surpassed their working memory capacity with 4 items. However, despite this limited storage capacity, they equally learned across trials as adults. So there were no age effects on the HAP learning effect, so that their recall performance equally improved as a function of repetition. Across sessions, we observed better delayed memory in children. So while adults showed a more intermittent pattern of forgetting and relearning, children showed a more smooth and stable pattern of retention or further improvement across sessions. This effect was the strongest for the implicitly repeated sequences. For the explicitly announced sequence, both children and adults retained well. Adults also had gained more explicit knowledge of the implicit HAP repetition. This, however, could not explain their drop in memory for it, indicating that the age effect happens at the level of implicit memory and cannot be explained by a potential age effect at the level of explicit memory. To conclude, we found evidence for an age-dependent shift in the long-term memorization of syllable sequences that consolidate into novel words. This effect was significant for the implicitly repeating sequence, for which adults significantly forgot, while for the explicit sequence, both children and adults retained well. We argue, therefore, for an underlying maturational effect at the level of implicit memory at which children are superior. This might have many implications for a better understanding of child superiority in the learning of certain aspects of language learning, such as learning grammar or learning novel word forms. For a more elaborate discussion on this and other details of the study, I invite you to read the paper. Please let me know if you have any questions or would like to discuss some parts of this paper. In the meantime, enjoy reading.